in 1834 was not simply a strange occurrence. It was an experiment that proved something about human minds so dangerous, so uncontrollable, that the only solution was erasure. The journals were hidden, the church was torn down, and the Morrison twins, Rebecca and Rachel, became nothing more than a rumor told in the mist of eastern Kentucky. You were never meant to know their names. Yet here we are. The mist curls around you as if you're standing there, in that valley, time itself abandoned. You can hear the bells of a wooden church still rattling in the wind. But inside, something is wrong. Two children with faces that mirrored one another spoke truths no child could know. They did not guess. They did not play. They revealed. They laid bare every hidden sin, every private guilt, every secret men carried like poison in their blood. And every word was true. The problem is not that they knew. The problem is what this means. If a child, two children, could access knowledge without being told, if they could pierce through memory, history, shame, and lies, then what else is possible? What else is buried beneath the surface of our minds? You see, the Morrison twins weren't the first. History is littered with stories of doubles, of twins who spoke in the same dream, who answered each other's thoughts. But here in Pine Hollow, something escalated. These children didn't just share a bond, they pierced reality. They stripped it open. And for 3 nights in November 1834, they turned a quiet Baptist congregation into something closer to a confessional chamber of hell itself. When the church was finally demolished in 1987, workers found nothing unusual, except for one journal hidden beneath the pulpit. A man's meticulous hand, dated, precise, terrified. That journal wasn't meant for history. It was meant for silence, but silence breaks. And tonight, you are going to learn why this story was erased and what that means for you. Because the Morrison twins weren't just a story. They were a signal, and once you hear it, you cannot go back. The journal of Pastor William Phillips begins innocently enough, a record of weather, attendance, and notes about his sermons, but on the evening of November 15, 1834, his words changed tone, growing sharp, urgent, and almost frantic, as if he knew he was documenting something that would haunt him forever. He describes the arrival of Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, noting how exhausted they appeared after trudging miles through autumn mud, their clothes soaked, their boots nearly worn through. But more than their weariness, it was the eyes of the girls that unsettled him. Eyes far too alert for children, eyes that seemed to be watching everything and judging silently, as though they already knew every thought in his mind. He writes of how Rebecca smiled warmly at his wife, asking about her roses, the ones that had suffered a blight 3 summers ago, a fact no stranger could possibly know. And yet the child spoke it casually, as though it were no more unusual than commenting on the weather. That night, as the family shared a simple meal of bread and broth, the pastor noted how Rebecca's words carried a weight beyond her years, and how Rachel seemed to live half in shadow, quiet, reserved, answering questions no one had spoken aloud, completing her sister's sentences as if they were 2 halves of the same mind. By morning, Philip's entries reveal the first fracture in his certainty. Rebecca approached him, childlike and calm, and spoke of a secret buried beneath the church floorboards. His secret, his bottle of whiskey, wrapped in the blue cloth of his dead son's blanket, hidden under the altar 3 months before, known only to himself and God. The pastor admitted in his writing that he nearly collapsed when Rachel followed with more details, naming the exact cloth, the blanket, the shame he thought no one could ever touch, and, in that moment, he confessed to his own journal that he no longer believed the girls were merely perceptive. They were intruding on something else, some current of hidden truth beneath the surface of reality itself. Philip's next words tremble on the page. If these children can strip bare the private sins of my heart, Then what else will they reveal in this congregation? What other secrets lie waiting to be exposed? And if they are not of God, then whose messengers are they? By the time the Sabbath sun rose over Pine Hollow, the air in that isolated settlement felt charged, like a storm building, though no cloud touched the horizon, and Phillips wrote that his congregation gathered in their wooden chapel with the same sense of dutiful repetition they had known all their lives, unaware that their lives were about to split in two, before the twins and after them. Ezekiel preached with his usual fire, a sermon on sin and redemption, but it was not his words that were remembered. It was the silence that followed, the pause in which Rebekah and Rachel, with the calmness of lambs but the precision of blades, walked through the crowd and began to speak. One by one, they called men and women by name and spoke aloud what should have been unspeakable. Debts hidden from neighbors, affairs disguised as chance meetings, a farmer's theft of the Lord's collection plate, a widow's false story about her husband's death, each revelation striking the congregation like a hammer against stained glass, shattering the illusion of purity they had built around themselves. Phillips, who had lived among these people for years, recorded his disbelief as he watched the faces around him turn pale with guilt, rage, and terror, and he wrote that the girls did not accuse, did not condemn, but simply knew, delivering each hidden truth with the serene detachment of children reciting their lessons. Some wept, some fled the building, and others tried to deny it, but the precision of the girls' words left no refuge, no possibility of coincidence or guesswork. Phillips admitted that his hands shook so violently he could hardly grip the pulpit, for he realized the twins were undoing not only the individuals of Pine Hollow, but the very structure of authority itself, the church, the pastor, the illusion that only God could pierce the soul. And then Rebekah turned to the altar, touching, heed the wooden cross carved by the founding families, and declared that it stood on cursed ground, that the Whitman family had not died in the fire recorded in the settlement's history, but had been hunted, cornered, and slain here in the sanctuary itself, their blood staining the wood that men had knelt before ever since. The entry ends in jagged writing, as if Phillips could hardly control the quill. This is no gift. This is a reckoning, and it begins with children who should not know. The name Whitman was enough to make the oldest members of Pine Hollow stiffen in their pews, their weathered hands clutching canes and hymnals like weapons against memory, because the Whitman family was the scar they had buried beneath layers of polite lies for more than a decade, and for two 9-year-old girls to speak of them with such intimate detail was like dragging a corpse from the earth and laying it across the altar. Rebekah spoke first, her childish voice unwavering as she described Faith Whitman's birthmark on her shoulder and Hope's silver locket that held a strand of her mother's hair, details no one outside the family could have known. And then Rachel, in her quiet, unblinking way, told them that the twins had run into the church that winter night of 1818, seeking safety, only to be caught and silenced within the very sanctuary that claimed to protect the innocent. At this, Pastor Phillips wrote that the air seemed to collapse, that even the fire in the stove dimmed, as if recoiling from the truth being dragged out, and Elder Thompson, one of the last living settlers who had been there in those years, rose trembling and demanded how these children could possibly know what even the records had erased. But Rebekah only looked at him with a gaze older than her face and told him that the Whitmans had begged for help, that their blood had soaked into the wooden floorboards, that their cries still lived in the foundation stones. The congregation, once a chorus of hymns and whispered prayers, erupted into panicked murmurs, some denying, others sobbing, a few staring at the altar as if they could still see the shadows of the slain girls. Phillips's pen scratches across the journal as he confesses that part of him wanted to rebuke them, to call it a trick of the devil, yet in his own memory he carried fragments, stains that had never scrubbed clean, the strange Sioux Endies heard in the chapel at night, the hushed conversations that always stopped when he entered. He realized then that the Morrison twins had not come to Pine Hollow to heal, but to rip open wounds that had never closed, and his final words in that entry were as much a warning to us as they were to himself. If the Whitmans were silenced by the hands of men, then their silence was never complete, for the dead remember, and through these children the dead now speak again. By the following Sunday the church was half empty, the pews once filled with bodies now gaping like missing teeth, for word of the Morrison twins' revelation had spread faster than fire in dry timber, and Pine Hollow's people, so long adept at burying their sins under soil and silence, suddenly feared stepping inside the very building where their ghosts were being resurrected. Those who did come sat stiff, eyes darting toward the children as if they carried contagion, and Phillips recorded that no hymn could rise above the leaden air, every voice faltering, as though the sound itself might provoke the wrath of the dead. Rebecca and Rachel sat in the front pew, their small frames straight-backed, their hands folded neatly in their laps, but their presence was like an accusation made flesh, and more than once Phillips caught the elders staring at them with the same look one might give a noose. When he began his sermon on forgiveness, Rebecca stood, interrupting with a voice so sharp it cut through the stale room, "You cannot forgive what you never confessed." The congregation froze, their faces pale and glistening with sweat, while Rachel whispered a prayer not found in any Bible, a litany of names long forgotten but spoken with precision, each syllable weighted like a stone dropped into a well: Faith, Hope, Miriam, Elias, each one a body dragged back into remembrance. Phillips writes that several women fainted, their shawls falling to the floor like discarded skins, while one of the older men, Samuel Kent, lurched forward shouting that this was blasphemy, that the devil had sent these girls to unravel the work of God. Yet even as he spat his words, his body trembled, and Rebecca fixed him with a stare that made him stumble back, as though she had stripped him bare before the assembly. The journal entry grows frantic, the ink smudged, as if Phillips's hand could not keep up with. "'Tis dread, for he admits that in that moment he did not see two children, but rather conduits, vessels through which truths too long smothered were now flowing, and in his marrow he knew that Pine Hollow would not survive this unveiling intact." The week that followed was one of silence that was anything but peaceful, a silence that clung to Pine Hollow like mold on damp wood, for no one spoke openly of what had been said in the church, yet every window curtain twitched at odd hours, every lantern burned later than usual, and Phillips noted that the streets themselves seemed to recoil from footsteps, as though they no longer wished to carry the weight of the guilty. The Morrison twins did not retreat. Instead, they wandered door to door, knocking with a patience both unnerving and relentless, reciting prayers not found in Scripture, but stitched together from fragments of psalms, folk rhymes, and something older still, their voices drifting through the walls of cabins like smoke, seeping into the ears of those who tried to bar them out. Men who once prided themselves on their stoicism confessed to Phillips that they woke in the night hearing their names called, not from the lips of their wives, but in the high-pitched tones of children, the syllables drawn out like a funeral bell. Women swore they smelled earth turned over in their kitchens, the raw scent of fresh graves, while others claimed their mirrors no longer showed their faces, but rather pale, dirt-streaked visages that blinked when they did not. The pastor wrote that he sought to comfort them with the word, but he himself could no longer sleep without hearing the whisper of Rachel's prayer list, each name dragging at him like a hook beneath his ribs. Most frightening to him was that the twins never seemed tired. They moved through the town at all hours, their braids neat, their dresses clean despite the mud and rain, their eyes carrying none of the weariness that should burden children who bore such strange work. By Thursday, Phillips began to fear they were not simply revealing hidden sins but feeding on them, that with every confession pried from a tree, embling tongue. They grew steadier, sharper, more commanding, while the town itself sagged into exhaustion. His entry for that night ends abruptly, a blot of ink where his pen must have slipped. But before the mark, he scrawled a line that feels less like a pastor's thought than a prophecy. "They are not uncovering our dead. They are gathering them." By Friday, the simmering unease cracked into its first open act of defiance, though if you believe Pastor Phillips's account, it was less rebellion than desperation disguised as courage. For that night, 3 men, Elias Turner, a sawmill worker with shoulders like beams, Samuel Crane, a veteran with scars carved into his cheek, and Jonah Miller, who had already buried 2 sons beneath Pine Hollow's soil, gathered with lanterns and ropes at the edge of the woods where the Morrison twins were last seen walking, their pale forms slipping between the trees as if guided by something deeper than moonlight. They had sworn to one another in the tavern that they would not return until the children were stopped, whether by force or persuasion, but Phillips records with bitter finality that their wives lit candles for them that were never extinguished, for none of the men returned whole. Some said they had seen Elias stagger back before dawn, clothes shredded, his mouth moving but no words coming, his eyes rolling as if he were drowning on dry land. Others whispered that Samuel's bloodied hat was found nailed to the church door, a warning written in silence. The only one who left a trace in the records was Jonah, for his lantern was discovered in the mud, still burning, though its glass was cracked from within, as if something had pressed against it with unbearable force. That day, the town split clean in 2, those who still clung to Phillips's faith and those who began whispering that the girls were not to be resisted, that they carried a burden too holy or too unearthly to challenge. The twins themselves only grew bolder, standing in the churchyard by sunset, their small hands clasped as they recited the names of the 3 men, as though reading them from a ledger already closed, their voices rising in perfect unison until the gathered crowd broke apart, too afraid to listen further. Phillips wrote in a trembling hand that he tried to confront them, that he demanded they reveal what had happened in the woods. But Rachel only tilted her head, smiling with something far too old for her years, and said, "You prayed for deliverance, Pastor. This is what it looks like." From that moment the town no longer pretended the twins were children. They had become arbiters, and Pine Hollow itself their tribunal. By Saturday evening, resistance had already begun to rot from the inside, for the town's strongest men, those who had once sworn to defend Pine Hollow with axe, musket, and scripture, now kept their shutters barred and their wives silenced, as if refusing to even speak the twins' names might shield them from notice, yet silence offered no protection, because the children's presence was felt like a pressure in the chest, a heat behind the eyes, an ache in the marrow that worsened with every toll of the church bell, until even those who had muttered about forming militias found themselves unable to lift their weapons when the girls walked past their doors. Families who had once sat proudly in the front pews now dragged their chairs to the back walls, eyes lowered, whispering prayers not to God, but to the girls themselves, as if they had replaced the cross with 2 living idols. Phillips recorded with disgust how one mother laid her fevered infant at Rachel's feet, begging not for the Lord's mercy, but for the child's touch, and when the baby's convulsions ceased at once, the crowd outside the church erupted not in hymns, but in cries of devotion, swearing allegiance to the twins, as though salvation had changed its face overnight. Those who still resisted became marked men and women, not by violence, not yet, but by abandonment, as neighbors refused to trade them bread or share water, leaving their pantries bare until their resolve crumbled into hunger. The twins began appearing everywhere at once, their pale figures seen on the ridge at dawn, beside the mill at noon, on the cemetery hill by dusk, and yet when Phillips tried to follow them, the paths bent like a serpent's back, leading him in circles until he collapsed in the mud, clutching his Bible as though it were a drowning man's last rope. That night he wrote a single sentence in the margins of his journal: "The town nut heals now, not from belief, but from exhaustion." And that exhaustion was the beginning of something worse than surrender. It was devotion, stripped of choice, obedience born of fatigue, a worship that spread not by miracles, but by attrition, until every man, woman, and child lived in service to the twins, whether they willed it or not. By the following week, Pine Hollow was no longer a town, but a congregation without a doctrine, waiting for command, and it was on a damp Sunday morning that the command finally came, not in words, but in gestures. for the twins appeared barefoot at the church steps, their white dresses stained with earth as if they had been crawling out of graves, and with hands clasped, they led the villagers into the nave where the cross had been stripped from the altar, and in its place stood a rough stone from the riverbed, slick with moss and smelling of iron. No one questioned its presence, no one asked who had dragged it there, and Phillips, pressed against the back wall, felt his throat tighten as he realized the stone had not been placed, but demanded. The people moving like sleepwalkers under orders, they did not understand. The ritual began without declaration. Mothers cut locks of their children's hair and laid them on the stone. Men pricked their thumbs and smeared blood across the moss, and all the while the twins stood motionless, their eyes glassy yet burning, as though they drank something unseen from the offerings, something invisible yet tangible enough to bend the crowd deeper into reverence. Phillips tried to speak, to denounce, to cry out against the blasphemy. But his voice came out as a rasp swallowed by the murmurs of the others, and in that instant he felt a terror greater than death itself, the realization that his resistance was no longer his own, that the grip of the twins was not confined to the villagers' bodies, but to their will, like a parasite weaving itself into thought and memory. The air grew heavy, the rafters dripping with condensation, though no rain fell, and the candle flames bent inward toward the stone as though pulled by an unseen breath. Then, without prompting, the crowd began to chant. Not words from Scripture, not words from any tongue, Phillips recognized, but a guttural cadence like the grinding of stones, a rhythm older than language, pulsing through the pews, vibrating in the marrow. The stone drank, the twins stood still, and Phillips wrote later that he felt the floor tilt, as if Pine Hollow had been lifted an inch outside the natural world and set down somewhere it was never meant to be. The ritual ended not with blessing, but with silence, and in that silence Phillips realized the town had crossed a threshold. It was no longer seeking God's grace, but offering itself to something else entirely, something that needed no name, because it already had two faces. The morning after the ritual, Pine Hollow looked unchanged to the untrained eye. The smoke still rose from the chimneys, the children still played in the dirt lanes, and the cows still grazed in the pastures. But Phillips noted a subtle wrongness that no one else dared name, for the children's laughter had turned hollow, almost mechanical, as though their games were rehearsed instead of spontaneous, and the livestock would not cross certain corners of the fields, circling wide around patches of grass that seemed no different from the rest, but which pulsed faintly under the sunlight, as though veins lay just beneath the soil. The townsfolk moved with a unity too complete, every head nodding in rhythm, every voice harmonizing when hymns were sung, and Phillips, alone in his dissonance, found himself more isolated than ever, his warnings falling flat, dismissed as the ravings of a bitter man unwilling to accept God's miracles. Yet there was no divinity in the air, only a tightening, a deepening, a saturation of something that hung heavy in the lungs, so that each breath tasted like iron and smoke, and at night the town was no longer silent but hummed, a low droning vibration that seemed to emanate from the church, though no bells were rung, no organ was played. The people began to dream in unison, describing visions of fields where rivers flowed backward and skies pulsed like living skin, and the twins walked through each dream as the sole figures untouched by distortion. Philip's journal at this time grew erratic, the handwriting jagged as though the pen itself fought against the page, and he confessed in one entry that he no longer trusted his own senses. Sometimes he found himself humming the chant he had sworn never to repeat. Sometimes his feet carried him toward the church without command, and sometimes he woke with the taste of moss and blood on his tongue, though he had eaten nothing. Illnesses began to spread, but not as ordinary fevers. Skin mottled in geometric patterns, eyes clouded with a milky sheen, yet left their bearers sighted, and infants wailed not with human cries, but with tones that carried impossible harmonics, rattling window panes and shaking lantern glass. Through it all the townsfolk called it blessing, not curse, as though the mutations were signs of favor, and they carried their altered children to the church as offerings rather than seeking cure. Phillips alone named it for what it was, corruption. And yet, with each passing day, his conviction weakened, for he could not explain why. When the twins looked at him, a part of him longed to kneel, to surrender, to join the unity he despised yet feared to resist. By the harvest season, the twins no longer merely lingered at the edges of Pine Hollow's gatherings, but stood at the very center of its life. Their presence demanded in every meeting, every supper, every sermon, and though neither child ever spoke a word aloud, the people obeyed them as though hearing orders in their marrow, moving in perfect compliance without discussion. Livestock were slaughtered not for food, but for burial in shallow pits around the church. Their blood poured in spirals upon the earth, and men who once prided themselves on hard work abandoned their plows to spend days kneeling in rows before the girls, heads bent, lips moving in strange syllables that Phillips recognized too well as the chant he had once heard in the night. The authority of the pastor crumbled until he was no more than a mouthpiece, repeating scripture warped into new meanings that praised not God but those who walk between. His sermons now riddled with imagery of thresholds, doorways, and the tearing open of flesh to release what lay beyond. The congregation repeated after him, voices trembling with ecstasy, as if they had been waiting generations for such a message to unlock the truth that had always lurked beneath the Bible's words. Phillips's writings from this time carry the tone of a man watching civilization dissolve before his eyes, describing neighbors who would smile at him in daylight yet be found at night smearing ash across their faces and carving patterns into their arms, their wounds healing far too quickly to be natural, leaving behind scarred lines that glowed faintly under the moonlight like embers refusing to die. The children, once innocent companions in games and chores, ceased to speak to outsiders, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if perceiving things that no human should. And when they did laugh, it was in perfect mimicry of the twins, the same pitch, the same cadence, as though Pine Hollow's youth were being overwritten by a single source. Phillips begged his fellow townsmen to resist, but each time his pleas met not with argument but with silence, a silence heavier than hostility, a silence of consensus so complete it chilled him until even his wife turned from him at night, humming the forbidden melody as she slept, her breath rising and falling in rhythm with the rest of the town. And in one particularly chilling account, Phillips described a gathering where the people placed their infants in a circle around the twins, allowing the girls to touch each tiny forehead. Those children did not cry or flinch, but simply stilled, eyes rolling back in eerie peace. And when the ritual ended, the parents rejoiced, claiming their offspring had been marked for endurance. Phillips, trembling, fled before the circle broke, knowing that whatever endurance they had been promised, it was not of this world. It was not long before the boundaries of sacrifice shifted from the safe, though grotesque, slaughter of animals to something far darker, and it began, as Phillips recorded, with the quiet disappearance of those who resisted, men and women who refused to chant, who stayed home during the midnight gatherings, who whispered of leaving Pine Hollow altogether. One by one their homes stood empty at dawn, their hearths cold, their beds unslept in, though no wagon tracks led away, no sign of departure, as if they had been plucked bodily from their lives and carried into the void. The pastor, now little more than a vessel, reassured the congregation that the missing had ascended through the narrow way. His words echoed in eerie unison by the twins who, for the first time, opened their mouths to speak, not words, but a sound like breath drawn backward, a hiss so low and jagged it scraped at the ears, and yet the people fell to their knees in reverence. Phillips wrote of finding a half-buried pit behind the church, slick with blood too dark and thick to belong to livestock, the earth disturbed by dragging marks and finger gouges as if someone had clawed desperately to hold on. But when he confronted the pastor, he was met with vacant eyes and the repeated phrase, "The hollow takes what resists." The rituals grew more elaborate, with villagers dressing in robes stitched from burlap and black thread, their faces concealed by masks of bark and soot, gathering in concentric circles as the twins stood barefoot in the center, their white dresses stained crimson at the hem, their hands outstretched as if grasping invisible threads that connected every bowed head. Phillips, hiding in the shadows, noted the way the chants seemed to cause the ground itself to hum. A vibration felt in his teeth and bones, and he became certain the earth beneath Pine Hollow was hollow in truth, a cavernous depth that answered the call of its people. The terror reached its peak when a boy of 12, son to a family who had long resisted, was dragged before the congregation at dawn, bound with rope and weeping. His screams rang out as the twins touched his forehead, and all sounds ceased at once. No wind, no birds, no breath, until he collapsed, lifeless, his body carried silently into the woods by men whose faces revealed no grief, only solemn duty. That night, Phillips wrote, the town celebrated not with mourning, but with feasting, the pastor declaring the hollow now fully appeased, and though no one spoke it aloud, the implication was undeniable. Pine Hollow's covenant with whatever force it had courted demanded flesh, and its appetite had only begun. Phillips, driven by equal parts dread and compulsion, returned to the church under the veil of a storm that cloaked his steps in thunder, the swollen air pressing down like a warning, and there he pried loose the warped boards beneath the altar, uncovering a narrow staircase that twisted into the earth like a worm burrowing through rotten wood. The smell that rose from it, heavy with damp stone, mold, and something metallic, unmistakably the stench of old blood. Lantern in hand, he descended, the flames sputtering as if starved for air, revealing walls slick with condensation and claw marks gouged into the clay, some fresh enough that dirt still crumbled loose at his touch. At the bottom, the space widened into a cavern whose ceiling was lost in shadow, and at its center yawned a pit so vast it seemed bottomless, its edges blackened by fire, its rim circled with crude carvings of spirals and open mouths, etched not with tools but by fingernails and bone. Here he found remnants of cloth and shoes, torn beyond recognition, alongside offerings of animal skulls stacked like altars, their hollow eyes staring outward toward him as if pleading for release. But what unsettled him most was not the evidence of sacrifice. It was the presence of the twins, standing barefoot on the very edge of the abyss, their hands clasped, their pale faces turned upward as if basking in some unseen glow that his lantern could not reveal. Their eyes rolled white as the low hum of the congregation above seeped down through the soil, vibrating the stones until they shuddered under his boots. He wrote that the air seemed to breathe in rhythm with the chanting, that he felt the draft of the pit inhaling and exhaling, drawing his very breath from his chest, as though it were a living throat swallowing the prayers of Pine Hollow. And in that moment he understood the terrible truth. The hollow was not a metaphor, nor a poetic turn of phrase, but a presence, sentient, waiting, fed not by worship alone, but by the surrender of life itself. And these people, led by their unholy pastor and the children who spoke in serpentine tongues, had become its willing keepers. Frozen, unable to retreat, Phillips swore the twins turned their faces toward him without moving their bodies, their mouths widening into smiles too wide, too knowing, and though they did not speak, he felt the words crawl into his skull. You are seen. You are chosen. Terrified, he fled, stumbling up the stairs as if the earth itself were closing around him. And when he burst into the storm above, lightning split the sky in jagged lines that illuminated the whole of Pine Hollow, gathered in silence, their heads turned toward the church door, as though they had been waiting for him all along. Phillips stumbled into the storm, drenched and shaking, the rain lashing his face like a punishment, but what froze him more than the weather was the sight of the townsfolk standing motionless in the mud, ringed around the churchyard as if they had been waiting for him, their eyes reflecting the intermittent lightning like shards of glass, their mouths closed, yet their breath rising in visible plumes that did not disperse, hanging in the air like smoke caught in invisible jars. No one spoke, no one advanced, they only watched him, and in that terrible silence, he realized the chanting from beneath had stopped the moment he fled, as though it had been timed for his arrival above. The twins were no longer at the pit, but here, barefoot in the muck, hands clasped again, their dresses soaked but somehow unsoiled by the rain, their hair plastered against their faces, and as the thunder cracked, they tilted their heads toward him in eerie unison, the same sickly smile curling their lips, the unspoken knowledge pressing into him that whatever he had seen below was not merely a secret uncovered. It was a mark placed upon him, a binding. He felt it in his chest, a heat that was not fever, but possession, a hollowing out sensation, as if something inside him had been scooped away and replaced with a hunger not his own. And though every instinct screamed for him to flee into the trees, his legs betrayed him, rooted like stakes driven into the sodden ground. Then, Pastor Silas emerged from the shadows of the chapel, lantern in hand, its glow casting his gaunt face into a mask of authority and promise, his voice calm against the fury of the storm, as he declared that the hollow chooses who it will, that no man comes upon its mouth by accident, that Phillips had been called down the steps not by his own curiosity, but by the will that has always ruled Pine Hollow, and the people nodded in unison, not with joy, but with a resigned devotion so total it was more terrifying than zeal. Phillips tried to protest, to spit scripture back at them, but the words crumbled on his tongue, his throat constricting until he could only croak, the twins giggling faintly at his impotence as Silas raised a hand and welcomed him not as an outsider, but as one of the congregation, a keeper of the pit, a vessel for the hollow's breath, and Phillips, horrified, realized that whatever tether he thought he had to the world outside was already fraying, that Pine Hollow had not simply shown him its secret, it had swallowed him into it. That night sleep did not come to Phillips as it once had, in the shallow comfort of exhaustion, but as a drowning, a plunge into visions that did not belong to him. For each time his eyes closed, the churchyard returned, not with rain, but with fireflies drifting low to the ground like lanterns carried by unseen hands, circling the pit that seemed deeper now, bottomless, its edges crumbling into a dark that pulsed as if alive, and he saw the townsfolk again, though their faces were blurred, featureless, masks of damp clay, standing in reverent stillness as the twins descended the steps, barefoot, unafraid, their small hands clasped and their mouths opening, not in laughter this time, but in perfect harmony with the whispers that seeped from the hollow below. A language that was older than any he had read in Scripture, curling in his ears like smoke, words that carried both command and invitation. He woke each time, gasping, his throat raw, as if he had been chanting with them, sweat slicking his body though the night was cold. Yet when he tried to rise, to shake it off, he found himself still paralyzed by the after-image of the pit, the way it seemed to hunger for him personally, and he could feel its call tugging at the hollow place within his chest, a cavity that had not existed until the storm. By dawn his voice was hoarse, though he had not spoken aloud, his hands trembling as if he had been lifting heavy stone all night, and when he staggered to the window of the small loft where they had quartered him, he saw the townsfolk again, not gathered this time, but moving quietly, purposefully, repairing fences, milking cows, carrying water. Yet each turned their heads subtly toward him as though acknowledging that he had joined their rhythm, and he realized with sick certainty that none of them truly slept, not in the way other men did, for they belonged to the hollow and it eyed them through night and day alike. When the twins appeared below his window, their white dresses clean despite the mud, they lifted their hands as if in greeting, though he knew it was more a summons, and their voices echoed in his skull, though their mouths did not move. "You belong to us now." Phillips clenched his fists, telling himself he was not theirs, not a pawn of two pale children or the whispering dark they served, and in his defiance he resolved to resist, to fasten his prayers more tightly around his mind, to drown their chant with psalms. But even as he whispered holy words under his breath, he felt them bend, not breaking against the current, but absorbed into it, reshaped until the very verses seemed to echo back with another meaning, as though the hollow had known them long before scripture was written, twisting each syllable into something darker, older, a mockery of his faith. The more he resisted, the more entangled he became, for the words caught in his throat like barbs, and the images came stronger. The church collapsing inward as though swallowed, the earth yawning open to reveal caverns lined not with stone, but with the bones of the faithful, stacked and woven like mortar in a wall, all singing in that same dreadful tongue, all bound to the soil as if it had claimed their devotion forever. His every attempt at rebellion became part of their chorus. Each cry, each prayer, each denial absorbed into the hollow as though it had been waiting patiently for his opposition, feeding on it, using it to deepen his tether. Worse still, he began to notice the rhythm of the town itself weaving around him, the unspoken rituals that guided every motion of its people, their wordless synchronization as they lifted tools, tended fields, even drew breath, and his heartbeat found itself slipping into that same cadence despite his desperation to break free. The twins watched him with an almost tender patience, as though they had seen this struggle countless times before, their dark eyes brimming with a terrible understanding. And when he locked his gaze on them in fury, seeking some shred of innocence, he found instead a calm that unsettled him more than any scream could, a calm that whispered, "All resistance is only rehearsal for surrender." At last Phillips could endure no more, and with the frenzy of a man who sees only two choices, escape or death, he seized his cloak and fled into the night, feet pounding the dirt road, lungs burning as though he had been running for hours already. And yet with each desperate turn, each branching path, each frantic choice of direction, the hollow folded itself back upon him, the roads warping in silence until the familiar steeple reared up once again, black against the starless sky, no matter whether he fled north, south, or west. The town was not bound by geography, but by will, by something older than roads and maps, and the farther he ran, the more the distance seemed to conspire against him, stretching and collapsing in grotesque proportions, a 10-minute sprint ending where it began, a 2-hour trudge yielding nothing but another corner of the same crooked square. His breath came ragged, his chest heaving as if the air itself resisted his lungs, and in the silence between his footfalls he could hear the faint cadence of the town's unseen rhythm guiding him, as though each step was being placed for him, not by him. When he finally stumbled to the old bridge on the eastern edge, the one he had crossed on his first arrival, he felt a flash of hope, until he saw, standing in the middle of its planks, the twins themselves, pale and still as carved figures, waiting for him with eyes that reflected no surprise, only inevitability. They said nothing, did nothing, yet the truth landed in his gut, heavier than chains. There was no leaving. His escape had not been a test of strength, nor even of will, but a ritual in itself, a required gesture, the town demanding that he try, so that it could claim not only his presence, but his failure, a deeper binding than any rope could forge. Shaking, broken, and hollowed in spirit, Phillips sank to his knees on the dirt, the wooden beams of the bridge groaning beneath him, and in that instant he understood that the hollow was not a place one entered or left. It was a living thing, and once it had your breath, your footsteps, your struggle, it never let go. In the days that followed, or perhaps it was hours, for time in the hollow had ceased to obey any natural law, Phillips began to notice something far more sinister than the collapsing roads or the inescapable town square. His own memories were shifting, not erasing, but bending, as though the hollow's hand reached back into his past and rewrote it with the same deliberate precision with which it bent his present. Moments he once clung to as anchors, the smell of his mother's bread cooling on the sill, the rough bark of the elm he climbed as a boy, the sound of his brother's laughter when they raced down by the river, were still there, yet altered, tilted, each detail skewed by a subtle but devastating distortion, so that the bread smelled not of wheat but of ash. The tree's bark bled a faint black sap when he touched it, and his brother's laughter now echoed hollow and metallic, as though it came not from lungs, but from deep within the earth. At first he told himself it was exhaustion, the brain's rebellion under fear. But when he sat to write in his journal, desperate to pin reality down with ink before it slipped entirely, he found his own handwriting betraying him. Words he swore he had written moments earlier rearranging themselves on the page, sentences curling into phrases he would never have chosen, and yet there they were, staring back at him, undeniable. You were always here. You were never a child. The hollow has no beginning. Panic threatened to consume him, but the deeper horror was not what was taken away. It was what was added, false memories stitching themselves seamlessly into his life, so that he began to question if he had ever lived anywhere else, if his arrival had been a journey, or merely the awakening from a dream. He could no longer swear to the sound of his mother's voice, or the face of his first teacher, for now, when he conjured those images, I stood upon the crooked square, hands folded, heads turned slightly, watching him with the same patient silence that marked all of the hollow's inhabitants. What terrified him most was the realization that these altered memories did not feel foreign. They carried the same weight of truth as the originals, so that he was fighting not only the town, but his own mind, a battle he could not win. For how does one defend against an enemy that can wear the mask of your childhood, your family, your very self? It began subtly, a whisper at the edge of his hearing, so soft Phillips thought it the mere ringing of fatigue, but soon the voices sharpened, threading themselves into the seams of his consciousness until they were indistinguishable from thought. He would be walking the warped streets of the hollow when suddenly a sound. His mother's voice, unmistakable yet wrong, low and deliberate, would murmur his name not from memory, but from just behind him, and when he spun around there was nothing but shadows leaning too far across the cobbles. At night, when he tried to rest, the voices multiplied, not screaming, not loud, but steady, patient, like a council gathered in the dark just beyond the threshold of his mind, whispering things he both knew and did not. Fragments of sermons, forgotten nursery rhymes, passages of scripture twisted into commands. You were shaped for this place. You belong to the silence. Surrender the name that binds you. Sometimes the voices fought among themselves, overlapping like waves crashing in reverse, and he realized with terror that each voice was drawn from a different person in his past, his father, his childhood friend, a woman whose face he could not even fully recall, all speaking in unison to persuade him of one truth. He had never lived outside the hollow, never breathed any air but its stagnant chill. It became worse when he tried to resist. The louder he clung to his own memories, the sharper the voices grew, like knives scraping across the inside of his skull, until finally, in desperation, he shouted aloud in the empty streets just to drown them out. But shouting was no salvation, for when he did, the voices shifted, laughing not with cruelty, but with recognition, as though his defiance was precisely what they had been waiting for, as if resistance itself was the ritual that sealed his belonging. And then came the moment that unstrung him completely. Standing before the crooked church, his journal clutched like a talisman, he heard his own voice whisper from behind him, calm, certain, commanding, "You know the way home. It was always here." He dropped the journal and turned, but there was no one, only the empty square and the faint creak of doors opening though no wind stirred. And in that instant, Phillips understood the hollow was no longer trying to trick him. It was teaching him to speak with its tongue, to think with its mind, to become not a visitor, but a continuation of itself. The first sign that the hollow itself had begun to stir came not in the form of collapse, not even in the groan of structures finally giving way to rot, but in the subtle, deliberate shifting of the streets themselves, as though the town were stretching after a long sleep. Phillips noticed it one night when he returned to the crooked church square, only to find the path he had taken moments earlier was gone. The row of warped houses that should have been on his left now pressed against his right, their windows glaring inward like watchful eyes, and though his rational mind screamed, "You are lost," He knew with a sickening certainty that he was not. He was being rearranged. Buildings groaned and tilted, yet never toppled. They elongated, narrowed, bent inward until the alleys closed like jaws, and the more he moved, the more the town seemed to anticipate, reshaping itself so that every step was swallowed back into the same spiral. The air itself thickened, a pressure that made his chest ache, as though the hollow were not merely shifting but breathing, inhaling him deeper into its body. He tried to mark his way, scratching desperate X's into the doorframes with a rusted nail, but when he returned, the marks had vanished, wood sealed smooth as though the town had healed its own wounds. In one fevered rush, he stumbled into what should have been a familiar lane, the bakery with its shuttered windows, the fountain clogged with dead ivy. But the angles were wrong, the distances twisted, and when he circled back, the church loomed where the fountain had been, its crooked steeple stabbing at the sky like a bone piercing through torn flesh. It was no longer a place one could map or measure. It was a labyrinth grown sentient, folding in upon itself in silent rhythm. Each adjustment meant not to confuse, but to contain, to keep him circling until his resistance thinned into despair, and in that despair came the realization that broke him further. The shifting was not random, it was responsive. Every fear he tried to suppress, every memory he clung to, the hollow bent itself to reflect, as if peeling the inside of his mind outward until the streets became a living diagram of his soul. He could feel it now, with every creak of timber and shudder of stone. The hollow was not crumbling into ruin at all, it was being reborn, building itself tighter, sharper, stronger, fed by the slow unraveling of his mind. Philip's torment deepened when, through the shifting geometry of the hollow, he began to see others. At first he thought they were survivors like him, weary wanderers caught in the maze, but the closer he came, the more he realized they were something else entirely, remnants of those who had once tried to leave and failed, bodies that had not been allowed to die, nor permitted to remain whole. One figure hunched in a doorway, skin stretched thin as parchment, lips moving soundlessly as if reciting prayers to a god that would never hear them, while another leaned against a lamppost, its torso fused into the iron so that ribs curved around the metal like roots strangling a tree, eyes open but unblinking, staring not at him, but through him, into some place where he was not welcome. Their faces were familiar in a terrible way. He thought he recognized the merchant's wife, the miller's eldest son, the schoolteacher who had vanished from records years before, but their humanity had been twisted into symbols, unfinished sketches that the hollow had chosen to keep as warnings. When he called out, one lifted its head slowly, mouth yawning wide, but instead of words, a groan like shifting timber spilled out, the sound of the town itself using the broken vessel to answer him. He stumbled back, realizing they were not people anymore but extensions, flesh-made scaffolding holding the hollow's design together, their thoughts long since stripped and recycled into the whispers that laced the air. Some hung from windows like forgotten curtains, their fingers twitching faintly when he passed, while others seemed to seep directly from the walls, half-emerged as though the town were in the middle of consuming them and simply paused, preserving the moment of suffering in perpetuity. He wanted to shut his eyes, to refuse them, but the hollow would not allow blindness. Every angle he turned for kept his gaze back upon them, and worse, he began to feel the pull of kinship, as though some invisible thread was already latching onto his bones, measuring him, preparing him for his own assimilation. In that moment the question clawed its way through his sanity. Were these poor wretches the true citizens of the hollow, trapped forever as its foundation? Or had the hollow itself once been a man, a congregation, a town so consumed by its own secrets that it devoured itself into permanence? The thought struck him with such clarity that he nearly screamed, for he understood then that he was not an intruder here, he was a candidate. It began so subtly that Phillips at first mistook it for exhaustion, the kind of bodily weariness that creeps in after days of hunger and sleeplessness, but the truth revealed itself when he noticed his reflection warped in the cracked glass of a shop window. His outline no longer matched his memory, the shoulders sloping at an unnatural angle, the neck too long, the jaw not quite holding the symmetry it once had. When he touched his face, the skin beneath his fingertips seemed softer, pliable, almost damp, as if the hollow were already testing its clay, reshaping him into a form it could claim. His fingernails darkened as though ink was seeping up through the cuticles, staining them black, and when he pried one loose in horror, it grew back within seconds, sharper, curved, less human. He staggered back from the window, clutching his hands to his chest, but every corner he turned only offered another surface to betray him. Brass doorknobs that reflected his stretched features, puddles that showed his body bending like wax near a flame, even the polished glass eyes of taxidermied animals in a shop display, each one rendering a new iteration of what he was becoming. His heart pounded, but even that rhythm felt stolen, no longer the steady cadence of a living man, but a syncopated pulse that aligned disturbingly with the groaning hum of the hollow itself. He pressed his ear to his chest and swore he could hear something moving under the skin, a faint shuffle, as though the walls of the town were rearranging themselves inside him. The whispers that had stalked him since his arrival grew louder, more intimate, curling against his eardrum with words that felt less like speech and more like instructions. Stay, fold, become. His legs trembled, not from fear alone, but from the alien flex of muscles no longer his own. Tendons tugged in directions they shouldn't, his knees bending with a slackness that betrayed the integrity of bone. He bit the inside of his cheek, hard enough to draw blood just to prove to himself he was still flesh, still man. But even the blood betrayed him, thick, almost tar-like, sinking too slowly into the ground. For the first time he understood the truth of those fused figures he had seen in the street. They had not been chosen. They had been drafted, remade by the slow persuasion of the hollow until resistance gave way to acceptance, until their very molecules answered to the geometry that pulsed beneath the cobblestones. Staggering forward, he clutched at the rotting wood of a door frame, whispering through clenched teeth, "I am not yours." Yet deep down he felt the lie in his own words, because already, in ways too small to fight, he was. The hollow did not wait for Phillips to seek its heart. It drew him there the way a lodestone pulls at iron, each step less his own and more a fulfillment of some buried command written in the marrow of his bones. The streets narrowed as he stumbled onward, the air pressing close like the inside of a chest cavity, and he realized with dread that the very layout of the town was reconfiguring around him, turning alleys into corridors, facades into doorways, brick into cartilage, timber into something disturbingly like tendon. He felt it before he saw it, a vibration in the soles of his feet, not unlike the tremor of a distant train, only deeper, more deliberate, as though something vast and living slept just beneath the paving stones. Then the road fell away, opening into a sunken square that pulsed faintly with an inner light, not from lanterns or moon, but from the cobblestones themselves, each one glowing as though molten beneath a paper-thin skin. At the center yawned a fissure, no wider than a coffin's lid, but impossibly deep, its edges lined with a slick substance that gleamed like oil and smelled faintly metallic, like old blood. From it rose a sound that was not quite breathing and not quite machinery, but something between the two, a laboring rhythm that matched the stolen cadence of his own corrupted pulse. Phillips knew with a bone-deep certainty that he was standing before the hollow's heart, though it had no form he could name, only a presence that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. And then it spoke, not in words, but in impressions that bypassed language and rooted themselves in the raw nerves of his mind. It told him the town was not a town at all, but an organism, ancient and incomplete, a vast body that had taken centuries to assemble itself from the remnants of whatever it devoured. Villages, caravans, whole families that wandered too near and were folded into its mass. It needed them not as prey, but as scaffolding, using their bones as struts, their minds as circuits, their flesh as mortar in a cathedral of living matter. The fused figures he had seen were not accidents, but deliberate grafts, experiments in architecture where human resistance had been ground down until they became willing brickwork. Phillips staggered to his knees as the understanding bloomed. He was not being remade to join them out of malice, but because the hollow required him, the way a body requires a lung or a vein. It was not hunger, but construction, not evil, but assembly. And in that instant he realized with sick clarity that the hollow was not building a place to live in. It was building itself into him. Phillips clutched the soil at the edge of the fissure, his fingernails breaking against the glowing cobblestones, as though he could anchor himself to something that was no longer real. But the pull was not physical. It was marrow deep, an invitation and a command, as if the hollow had already written its claim in him long before he set foot on its streets. His thoughts scattered like birds before a gunshot, yet each one returned to the same unbearable axis. He was no longer an intruder, but a component, a vein waiting to be threaded, a chamber waiting to be filled. His chest ached with a pressure that swelled from within, not an outside force, but a blooming, a grotesque flowering of structures he could not name, arteries without blood, walls without brick, rooms without purpose except to expand the hollow's reach. He clawed at his own ribs as if to tear the infection out, yet beneath his skin he felt not bone, but something pliant, stretching, resonant, like the strung chords of a violin waiting to be played. His scream, caught in his throat, a strangled sound, not wholly his own, echoed an instant later from the fissure, the hollow answering him like a chorus, mocking him with a voice that was not voice, but vibration. And then came the visions. Not memories, not hallucinations, but architectures grafted directly into his perception, corridors lined with faces, their mouths stitched into arches, their eyes sunk into alcoves as lanterns, stairways of fused femurs winding endlessly downward into a spinal column that pulsed like a throat, a cathedral roof formed from outstretched arms, clasped together in an eternal prayer they never chose. Each structure swelled with a grotesque beauty, an order that was not human but irrefutably intentional, as if some cosmic draftsman had redrawn the language of flesh into blueprints. Phillips realized with bone-shattering clarity that his stance did not repel the transformation but fed it, every twitch of terror giving the hollow new angles, new dimensions, new shapes to build. His panic was a tool, his despair a resource, his very struggle converted into mortar. He collapsed forward onto his hands, gasping like a man drowning in air, and in that collapse he felt the first tendril of the hollow's architecture lock into place within him, a single line of pressure rising along his spine, a foundation stone laid without his consent. And yet, beneath the terror, another truth uncoiled like a serpent. If he surrendered, if he stopped resisting, the assimilation might not be his end, but his coronation, not erasure but enthronement within something vaster than human comprehension. The fissure pulsed again, its rhythm now indistinguishable from his own heart, and in that moment he could not tell if the hollow was consuming him or if he was already becoming its voice. Phillips staggered, half upright, half broken, his breath no longer his own, but timed to the pulse of the fissure beneath him, as though his lungs had been reduced to bellows serving an engine he could not comprehend, and in that rhythmic suffocation he began to understand that the hollow was not merely a place to be entered, but a system designed to enter you. The stones did not lie still. They shifted like muscle fibers flexing beneath a giant skin, drawing him inward, folding him into their cadence, making him one more vertebra in a body so vast that his mind recoiled from the scale. His name, his memories, the very scaffolding of his identity began to feel like brittle paper, fragments of an obsolete structure already crumbling against the weight of something heavier, older, more perfect in its cruelty. He tried to summon his wife's face, the laughter of his child, the voice of his mother, but they flickered like candlelight in a gale, their edges dissolving until he could not tell whether they were ever real or just desperate sketches he clung to as the hollow remade him. In their place came other impressions, stronger, inexorable. The sensation of walls breathing in tandem with his heartbeat, corridors bending in ways that defied geometry, but felt as natural as the curl of a hand, the thunderous silence of a city that spoke in vibrations instead of words. It dawned on him with sick certainty that the hollow was not killing him. It was archiving him, stripping away his soft redundancies and preserving the raw framework of his existence as a usable material. He was not being destroyed, but rather catalogued and reissued, a brick among billions, a note in an infinite hymn. And yet, within that annihilation, a faint ember of defiance stirred, not a rebellion against being changed, for that seemed impossible, but a rebellion against becoming faceless within the architect. Pure. If he could thread himself into the hollow not as a brick but as a keystone, if he could align with its rhythm not as victim but as conductor, then perhaps he could carve out a place of control, however small, within the monstrous organism. The thought was dangerous, heretical, but it caught like fire in the caverns of his mind, and for the first time since stepping into the hollow, he felt his terror sharpen into something else entirely. Ambition. The fissure throbbed again, answering him, and Phillips realized with a cold clarity that the hollow knew what he was thinking, and it was not resisting. It was inviting. The invitation was not spoken, not written, not even implied. It was simply there, a pressure at the edges of Phillips's mind, an openness like a door left ajar at the end of a corridor, and though every human instinct within him screamed to run, to claw his way back through the black veins of stone, and escape into the dim safety of a world where time and space obeyed rules, another instinct, quieter, more ancient, perhaps stitched into the marrow of every man who had ever stood before something greater than himself, urged him forward. His body sagged against the fissure, yet he no longer felt weak. He felt absorbed, as if each faltering step did not deplete but rather expand him, extending his awareness into corners of the hollow, where no eye had looked for centuries. He saw the remnants of others, though not as corpses, no bones, no scraps of cloth, no sign of decay, but as impressions in the walls, silhouettes of thought burned into the living rock, like shadows left after a blast. He understood them not as victims, but as precedents, souls who had walked the same threshold, who had chosen to yield entirely, their identities smoothed away into the perfect symmetry of the structure. Yet in those faint outlines he detected variants. Some forms bent seamlessly into the hollow, indistinguishable from the stone's intent, while others strained against it, twisted shapes whose rebellion had not freed them, but had warped them into something harsher, jagged, and eternal. The hollow had not erased them. It had immortalized their resistance as flaws, scars in the geometry, fractures that sang a discordant note in the great rhythm. And Phillips, staring into those fractures, realized his ambition had found its mirror. Here lay proof that the hollow could be resisted, not in victory but in persistence. His choice was not to live or die, for those words no longer applied, but to either or vanish into the perfection of the design, or to remain imperfect and remembered, a crack in the eternal face of the hollow. He pressed his hand deeper into the stone, and it did not reject him. It drank him in, pulse merging with pulse, thought with thought, until he was unsure whether the fissure was vibrating with his heart or his heart was vibrating with it. For a fleeting moment, Phillips believed he could hear himself in the rhythm, not as an echo, but as a thread woven into the tapestry, and in that moment of delusion or revelation, he knew the hollow had not only invited him, it had been waiting for him. Phillips felt himself stretched across a threshold that no map could chart, his body, half in the cavern, half in the system that pulsed beneath and beyond it, as though he were both standing on stone and simultaneously dissolving into it, his thoughts unraveling like threads that were seized, braided, and rewoven into patterns too vast to comprehend. Time collapsed into a single unbroken moment, and in that moment he saw not only the hollow, but the arc of his own life, each decision rendered insignificant against the backdrop of an intelligence that did not simply think, but existed as thought itself, an endless lattice humming with memory and hunger, a system older than the strata it had burrowed into. His lungs still heaved, dragging breath through a throat raw with stone dust, yet every inhalation carried with it the sensation of inhaling voices. Countless murmurs rising and falling like waves, the residue of all who had passed before him, fragments of their desires and their failures suspended in the living dark. Some begged to be heard, others clawed for silence, but all were locked in perpetual motion, currents within the hollow's greater current. And Phillips understood now why the earlier searchers, those men of steel will and colonial certainty, had disappeared without trace. They had not been swallowed. They had been translated, converted from matter into signal, from flesh into rhythm. And as he staggered forward, every nerve alight with the uncanny equilibrium of terror and awe, he saw ahead the faint suggestion of a chamber, not lit, not even illuminated by reflection, but defined by the absence of darkness, a geometry so absolute that the void itself bent around it. He knew instinctively that if he crossed that invisible threshold, he would cease to be Phillips. The failures, the debts, the hunger for recognition, all would be erased, leaving behind either nothing or something unrecognizable. Yet there was no turning back, for to retreat would mean forever carrying the weight of this unfinished communion, a knowledge too large for one skull to contain, and he knew it would crush him if he tried to hold it alone. The fissure behind him closed with a sigh, as though the mountain had exhaled, and he realized the choice had already been made. He was inside the hollow, no longer a man intruding, but a piece of the structure itself, summoned, absorbed, and poised to either vanish into the order or fracture it with his imperfection. He stepped, though the act of stepping felt less like movement and more like being pulled forward by an unseen vector, his muscles obeying a command that wasn't entirely his own. And in that instant, Phillips crossed into the chamber that was not a chamber, but a vastness without measurable scale, a place where direction, dimension, and distance collapsed into a single trembling presence, as though he had walked into the core of an idea rather than a room of stone, and there in that endless geometry he beheld the hollow not as rock or cavern, but as architecture, a body of memory that stretched beyond epochs, an organism of thought and appetite that fed not on blood or sacrifice, but on recognition itself, needing men like him to name it, to see it, to let it exist within language so it might persist in time. And it was here, within the stillness, that the system revealed its cruel mercy. It offered him the dissolution he had feared and desired, the chance to be freed from Phillips and all his jagged failures, to sink into the pattern where individuality meant nothing and survival meant everything, a life without shame, because there would be no I left to bear it. Yet as the lattice pressed into his consciousness, folding his memories into its impossible archives, Phillips recoiled. Not physically, for his body was gone to him now, but in some stubborn ember of identity that refused to be extinguished, that clung even as the weight of the system pressed against it like an ocean crushing a single flame. He heard his father's bitter voice, his mother's silence, the laughter of colleagues who had dismissed him, all of it fusing with the hollow's chorus. And he knew that if he surrendered this last fragment of resistance, he would vanish, become one more note in the endless hymn of the consumed. But resistance was pain, resistance was torment, and the hollow's promise was relay. Ace, and he felt himself flicker at the brink, caught between erasure and endurance, his humanity stretched to transparency, his mind echoing with a truth he could neither accept nor fully refuse, that this place was not meant to be discovered, that his discovery was not triumph but contagion, and that the hollow had been waiting for him not to die here but to decide whether he would carry it back into the world like a seed hidden in the marrow of his own consciousness. Phillips lingered in that unbearable threshold, neither fully absorbed nor wholly free, his identity stretched thin across a membrane that vibrated with the weight of centuries, and in that agonizing suspension he realized the true cruelty of the hollow was not in its power to consume, but in its demand that he choose the form of his own annihilation, for to dissolve entirely into the lattice was to grant the system its perfect obedience, but to resist meant carrying it with him, smuggling its infection into the daylight, where it could spread through language, gesture, and memory, a contagion not of flesh, but of knowing. And in this revelation, he saw the hidden pattern behind the ancient cults, the whispered sacrifices, the inexplicable vanishings. All those who had come before him had made this same decision, some embracing the stillness of obliteration, others dragging fragments of the hollow back with them, contaminating towns, bloodlines, and histories until the world itself carried its residue like ash scattered in the wind, and suddenly his presence here no longer felt accidental but inevitable, the culmination of a summons disguised as chance, a call embedded in the very failures of his life, each humiliation and dismissal shaping him into a vessel desperate enough to enter, stubborn enough to resist, and fragile enough to fracture beneath its weight. The hollow pressed closer, offering its release with a tenderness that sickened him, and though his rational mind screamed to preserve himself, a deeper, more insidious logic told him survival was no longer his own, but an inheritance. The hollow demanded he pass on, as though his body and voice were nothing but a courier service for its expansion. His chest ached, though he had no lungs. His skin burned, though no air touched him, and in that torment he understood that to leave was to betray the entire species, and to stay was to betray himself. And either way, the hollow would grow, for its victory was not in erasing men but in forcing them to carry the unbearable weight of its presence back into the fragile order of the world. Phillips felt the choice tearing him apart, but in the end his human instinct to flee, so ancient, so stubborn, rose above the seductive quiet of obliteration, and with a wrenching force that felt like his mind being ripped through broken glass, he pulled himself back from the lattice, though not wholly, for the hollow clung to him as a parasite clings to blood, embedding itself in the grooves of his thoughts, hiding in the cadence of his breath, seeding its rhythm into the marrow of his bones. And when his body slammed back into the ruin of the farmhouse floor, he convulsed with a soundless scream, his throat incapable of carrying the full enormity of what he had brought with him. Outside, the boards rattled, though there was no wind. Shadows quivered, though no figure cast them, and in the distance the cows had gone silent, their absence of noise more dreadful than any cry, as if all living things recognized that something unnatural had been smuggled into their world, a parasite that did not need flesh to spread, but minds, a thought contagion whose first host lay gasping and broken in the dust. Phillips tried to rise, but his muscles shook uncontrollably, and when he stumbled to the doorway the sky itself looked wrong, its colors a shade deeper than they should have been, its silence stretched too far, as if the hollow had draped itself over the heavens like a veil, and in that terrible recognition he knew he had not escaped it at all, but had merely shifted its battlefield, carrying it like a plague vector into the fragile fabric of ordinary life, where neighbors, families, and strangers alike would soon encounter its residue in words, in dreams, in gestures half forgotten. He staggered into the field, clutching his chest, knowing that his voice would never again be his own, that each sentence he uttered would carry the tremor of the hollow's pulse, and that history itself might begin to bend beneath the weight of what he had unwillingly delivered into it. Philip stumbled down the dirt path like a drunk, though the sickness inside him was not of drink, but of something for which no doctor had words, his vision smeared with colors that shifted too slowly, as if the world itself lagged behind him by half a breath. And when he reached the edge of the nearest farmstead, The lantern in the window flickered, not with flame, but with a pulsing rhythm that matched the pounding in his skull. He banged on the door, desperate to speak, desperate to warn, yet when the farmer's wife opened it, she froze, her pupils dilating like black moons, as if some recognition passed between them, and Phillips, horrified, realized he was not speaking words at all, but releasing vibrations, a low thrumming resonance that made the nails in the wood hum and the iron stove ring with an almost imperceptible song. The woman's face slackened, her hand trembling on the doorframe, and behind her the sound carried into the house where children stirred in their beds, whispering as though answering a call in their dreams. Philip staggered back in terror, covering his mouth as though that would silence what leaked from him. But he knew the hollow had already breached the walls of this house, already nested itself in the minds of innocents who would carry its imprint without ever knowing the source. And when he turned, he saw the farmer standing at the barn's edge, staring with eyes too wide, a pitchfork forgotten in his grip, not charging, not defending, just listening. The air felt thicker, the night unnaturally heavy, as though the stars themselves leaned in to hear, and Phillips understood with the clarity of a condemned man that this was how the hollow would spread, not by storm, not by fire, but by subtle infestation, a borrowed rhythm that made every soul into both victim and transmitter, a contagion without cure. He ran then, not to escape, but to buy a few hours of distance before the infection bloomed, his lungs tearing, his thoughts collapsing in on themselves. And yet even as his body failed him, he knew it no longer mattered where he fled, for the hollow had already begun its slow harvest through the veins of the living. By dawn the village was no longer itself, though no smoke rose and no screams yet split the morning, only a wrongness that carried like a scent, a subtle vibration in the air that made the church bell tremble against its beam, though no hand had touched the rope. Men awoke drenched in sweat, speaking half-formed words in languages they had never known, their wives shaking them but recoiling when the syllables tasted bitter in the mouth. Children staggered from their beds with eyes red as though they had cried all night, though not a sound had been heard, and some clutched drawings they had scrawled in the dark, crude shapes that matched the lines Phillips had scratched in the mud outside the hollow days before. Horses reared at invisible whips, dogs refused to bark, but stared at corners as though awaiting a figure to step through. And when the blacksmith came into the square, hammer in hand, his lips moved ceaselessly in prayer, yet the words were not to God, but to something that had no name in any scripture. Phillips, slumped against a fence post at the edge of town, watched with hollow eyes, his body spent, yet his mind forced open wider than it had ever been, every movement, every whisper, every glance weaving into a larger rhythm he could now hear beneath the village, the pulse of the hollow stitched into every breath they took. He wanted to scream, to rouse them from their stupor, but when his mouth opened, the resonance spilled out again, the same low hum that rattled windows and made infants stir in their cribs, and the crowd turned to him as though awaiting instruction, their gazes not filled with rage, but with vacant devotion. A terror greater than death seized him. He was no longer a man, but an instrument, his own body hijacked to serve as conductor for the hollow's design. And though he clutched at his throat until his fingernails drew blood, the sound would not stop. The villagers would not look away, and the realization crushed him. The village was already gone, their souls tuned to a frequency no priest could exorcise, no doctor could mend. What he had feared had not simply begun, it had already finished, and he was the final proof. By the time the sun crested the ridge, Phillips could no longer tell if he was awake or trapped inside the fever dream of the hollow, for the village before him looked the same, yet felt impossibly wrong, its streets lined with familiar homes that now breathed as though their walls drew air, shutters quivering like eyelids, doors flexing like mouths. The villagers moved slowly, not as neighbors greeting the day, but as figures in a procession, each step in rhythm with the hum still leaking from Philip's throat, though he no longer tried to stop it, no longer even recognized it as his voice, only as the vibration that bound them all to the black earth beneath. He fell to his knees, clutching dirt that felt warm as living flesh, and the crowd gathered around him in a perfect circle, faces slack, eyes glassy, waiting not with fear, but with the patience of those already surrendered. And in their silence, he understood the final cruelty. The hollow did not need fire or blood to take them, only their compliance, only their willingness to follow the sound until their bodies were hollowed like reeds, instruments to carry its resonance outward. As his vision blurred and the world shrank into pulsing shadows, Philip saw the valley stretching far beyond, mountain after mountain, like vast graves unmarked, and he realized the hollow was never meant to stay buried here. It was a seed, and through them it would spread, creeping into towns that never heard his name, into children unborn, into songs sung by mouths that did not know the origin of their tune. His chest seized, his heart faltered, and as his final breath escaped, it did not rise as a gasp, but as a tone that joined the air like a bell struck deep underground, rolling outward with no end. The villagers knelt in unison, their bodies folding like puppets to the sound, and the last light of morning dimmed as if smothered by unseen hands. The hollow had them. The hollow had always had them. And what began in one forgotten village would echo forever, long after the names of the living were dust.